Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
President-elect Donald Trump promised an aggressive slate of policies during his campaign for a second term that he said would strengthen the U.S. economy.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff.
No tax on tips.
I will end inflation.
Prices will start to come down.
Now that Trump has won the election, the question has shifted. Will these promises play out the way he sold them to the American people? And how could these policies evolve as he tries to put them into practice?
As the old saying goes, politicians campaign in poetry, but govern in prose.
Tom Orlik is the chief economist for Bloomberg Economics. And as the country prepares for Trump to take office, Tom and his team have been looking closely at some of his key economic talking points. They wanted to understand how Trump's policy proposals could transform the country, now that his second term isn't a hypothetical, but a reality that's just 2 months away. Today on the show, we do the math on the true cost of Trump's economic agenda, what it could mean for inflation, and how soon U.S. consumers and companies can expect to feel the impact. This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. Well, Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here, Sarah.
Tom, inflation and prices and economic concerns were really front and center in this U.S. presidential election. How should the American people and the world be thinking about what a Trump presidency will actually mean for the future of the U.S. economy?
So let's be clear, Sarah. Past US administrations have not covered themselves in glory when it comes to economic policy and making the economy work for the American middle class. Let's think about inflation under the Biden administration. Now, they were dealt a tough hand with the pandemic lockdowns and reopening. Still, inflation running close to 10%, that's really high and had a really significant negative impact on the pocketbooks of US households. So the Trump team was, I think, completely right in identifying failures of past economic policy as a big concern for voters and a big opportunity for them. The big question is, well, do they have the right policies to solve those problems?
How does your team do the math to calculate the economic impact of a presidency?
Well, it's pretty tough, Sarah, and it's especially tough with the Trump administration for a couple of reasons. First, in general, incoming administrations talk about small tweaks to policy. We'll do a bit more over here, a bit less over there. But Trump's talking about seismic shifts in policy. The highest tariffs, for example, that we've seen since the start of the 20th century. The second complexity, of course, is trying to disentangle what's the kind of campaign trail red meat commitment versus what could plausibly be delivered in office.
Well, let's talk about those promises versus that reality.
Sarah, I have to say I'm a tiny bit disappointed by the alliterative failure in your framing of the question. I mean, we could have gone with rhetoric versus reality, promises versus plausibility. Trump is going to be inheriting an economy where inflation has already come way down and is basically trending back to target. Now, if we think about Trump's actual policy proposals, we think about tariffs, which are going to make imports more expensive. If we think about tax cuts, which are going to juice growth and so make labour markets stronger and so allow workers to bid up wages, well, they're not hyperinflationary. We're not talking about price changes going back to 10% like they did after COVID reopening, but they're certainly more inflationary than they are disinflationary.
Bloomberg Economics focused on 5 key economic pillars that could look different under Trump: taxes, tariffs, immigration, regulation, and the Federal Reserve. Let's dive in on taxes for a second. Trump's tax cuts from his first term are expiring in 2025. Will he renew them? Do we expect him to add additional tax cuts?
So Trump has made a number of promises on taxes on the campaign trail. He's talked about extending the tax cuts which he introduced in his first term. He's talked about exempting tips from taxes. He's talked about exempting Social Security from taxes. He's talked about a big cut in the corporate tax rate.
Tom's team found that Trump's proposed tax cuts would cost the U.S. trillions of dollars in revenue. It would drive the U.S. debt up to roughly 150% of GDP by 2034.
Now, with the Senate, and we don't know yet, but quite likely with the House as well, there's quite a lot he could do on taxes. At the same time, markets do not like unfunded tax giveaways. So we don't think Trump is going to face much constraint from Congress, but we do think that Trump is going to face quite a lot of constraints from the markets. If he attempts trillions of dollars of unfunded tax cuts, then the markets are going to say no, and they're going to bid up Treasury yields, and that's going to be a constraint on his freedom of maneuver. So our bet is that we get some tax cuts, we get an extension of those tax cuts from his first term, we don't get the more ambitious proposals that he's put on the table. And what that's going to mean is slightly stronger growth, slightly higher inflation, and a more rapid increase in the US debt.
So one of Trump's other bold positions has been on tariffs. He's proposed levying major tariffs on China and possibly on Europe. What do we know about the economic impact such a large tariff increase could have on the US economy? What has your team found?
So on the campaign trail, Trump talked about 60% tariffs on China and 20% tariffs on the rest of the world. And that would be an absolutely enormous shock to the global trade system and the US economy. It would take US tariffs back to a level last seen after the Smoot-Hawley Act in the early 1930s, which most economists believe significantly deepened the Great Depression. Now, that, of course, raises the question, well, would he really do it? My instinct is probably not, for a couple of reasons. First, Trump is a transactional guy, right? And so I think he views these numbers as a threat which starts a negotiation. And his expectation is that other countries would come back with concessions, there'd be a negotiation, and then enables him to extract some concessions from Beijing, some concessions from Brussels, some concessions from trade partners in the rest of the world. We'd have some higher tariffs. He needs those to offset the tax revenue losses he would get when he cuts taxes, but we wouldn't go to that 60%, 20% number. Secondly, the evidence of his first term is that he does this in a kind of smart way, right? Or at least a way which is intended to minimize the cost on US consumers and US businesses. So tariffs in his first term exempted smartphones and tablets, for example, and the kind of things which would have really hit Apple and other US economic champions.
What would Trump tariffs mean for the US's GDP?
For US GDP, for US growth, it would be a negative. The US would be exporting less. That means less output, less jobs, less income. It would also mean a very significant negative impact on some market champions, companies like Apple, for example, which have supply chains which stretch across the United States and China. What would happen to those supply chains if 60% tariffs were introduced on all US-China trade? Well, I'm not an Apple expert, but I can tell you nothing good. And for inflation, it would mean pressure for prices to rise. Because if you put a tariff on imports, well, that means consumers have to pay more for everything from Nike trainers to Apple smartphones.
Coming up, how Trump's anti-immigration agenda could slow economic growth, and why the Fed's job of controlling inflation could get even harder under a second Trump administration. Let's talk about immigration for a moment. Trump has really threatened to crack down on immigration into the U.S. and to increase deportations. What kind of impact would that have on the labor market and on the broader economy?
Let's think about the growth piece of it, and then let's think about the inflation piece of it. So where does economic output come from? Well, it's workers and capital, right? workers and factories, workers and offices. So if you take workers out, if you deport millions of people, well, your workforce is smaller, and so your output is smaller. So the effect of deportations on economic growth, pretty categorically negative.
Just how negative? Well, if Trump deported all unauthorized immigrants who entered the U.S. since 2020, Bloomberg Economics estimates that U.S. GDP would shrink by more than 3% by 2028.
The impact on inflation, well, that's a bit more complicated. If you think about specific sectors of the economy, specific states, for example, construction or retail, where there's a lot of unauthorized migrant workers, think about states like Texas, where there's a lot of unauthorized immigrants. Well, if you kick a bunch of those workers out of the country, you've got less workers. So the workers who remain have got more bargaining power, they can demand more wages. You've got inflationary pressure in some specific sectors, in some specific states. Would it be inflationary for the economy as a whole? Well, that's a little bit where the complexity comes in, because everybody is a producer, they contribute to supply, and a consumer, contributing to demand. So if you take a person out of the economy, you're losing some supply, but you're also losing some demand. And what our modelling suggests is that the loss of demand is a bit bigger. And so for the economy as a whole, when you deport a bunch of people, the impact is not more inflation, it's actually less inflation.
Tom, we've been talking a lot about rhetoric versus reality. How does that play into Trump's immigration proposals? Is there a world where he sees the economic reality of implementing these and dials them back?
I mean, we've not talked about the humanitarian cost of this, right? I mean, The humanitarian cost is a big part of the picture, right? Tracking down unauthorized immigrants, herding them into detention centers. But leaving that aside, the logistics of a mass deportation policy are very complicated and very expensive. The economic impact, certainly for businesses that are working in construction, certainly for businesses that are working in retail or catering, well, they'd also be pretty significant. So I think, as with tariffs, we are going to see a campaign in poetry, govern in prose dynamic, where certainly Trump's border policies are more severe than we've seen under the Biden administration, but delivery on some of his campaign pledges to have the biggest deportations in US history, well, we'll have to see if that's plausible or not.
Well, Tom, let's talk about deregulation. The Biden administration made antitrust regulation a big part of its economic agenda. How does your team expect Trump to approach mergers and antitrust concerns? How might that impact the cost of consumer goods?
Particularly with Lina Khan leading the charge, the Biden administration's taken a pretty aggressive stance on antitrust issues. Now, for the incoming Trump administration, would that stay the same? Well, I see a couple of conflicting impulses. On the one hand, the Republicans are pretty hostile to some of the big tech companies in California. They see them as bastions of kind of democratic politics. They see them as companies that are kind of tilting the public debate in a way which is unfavorable to them. On the other hand, the instinct of Trump, the instinct of the Republican Party is to be pro-business, anti-regulation. So how's that going to net out? Well, I think some of the big tech companies are going to see pressure, fractious relations with the Trump administration. But I think that antitrust crusade that we've seen from Lina Khan under the Biden administration, I suspect that that's not going to be a big feature of Trump policy.
Well, it's up to the Fed to deal with how these policies impact the economy and, in particular, impact inflation. How does your team expect the Fed to react to these Trump policies as it sets interest rates and tries to do its job, which is to keep inflation in check?
That's a great question, Sarah. And so for the Fed, we think that the Trump win introduces a sort of head-spinning array of conflicting dynamics. Right now, we've got long-term borrowing costs, the 10-year Treasury rate sharply higher than it was a few weeks ago. We've got the US dollar sharply stronger than it was a few weeks ago. What that means is financial conditions have tightened, and that adds downward pressure on growth. And so it adds pressure for the Fed to cut more. On the other hand, as we've discussed, tariff policy from Trump, tax policy from Trump, well, that's probably going to be inflationary. So the Fed looking into the future, anticipating these more inflationary policies, well, that means pressure to cut less. And then the last piece of the picture, well, the Fed is independent and they jealously guard their independence. Past Republican presidents, apart from Trump, Democrat presidents have been respectful of Fed independence. Trump is not respectful of Fed independence. He's unfiltered in sharing his views on what the Fed should do. And that means there's an additional dynamic for the Fed, which is the pressure to guard their independence and demonstrate that they are immune from political pressure, which at the margin probably means an instinct to cut less. For the December meeting, don't think any of this really matters that much. 25 basis point cut is baked in. Looking into 2025, our pre-election forecast was another 100 basis points of cuts. But with all of these conflicting dynamics, with conditions changing quickly, that forecast is subject to some pretty significant uncertainty.
And how soon can we expect to feel the ripple effects of Trump's policies through the American economy? How much are we feeling now, even before Inauguration Day? How much might we feel the first weeks and months?
So markets move really fast. The Trump trade over the summer already started pricing in the possibility of a Trump win, with the markets betting that would mean more tariffs, less taxes, more debt, adding up to higher interest rates and a stronger dollar. When Trump won, that Trump trade got an additional impetus. Rates moved higher, the dollar moved higher. That's already having a big impact on the US economy. Higher rates mean higher mortgages, challenge for the housing market. When are the policies going to start rolling out? Well, drafting policies is a time-consuming process. You need a leadership team in place. You need an analytic process to design the policy. You need a drafting process to write the policies, a legislative process to approve the policies. That's not going to be something that we see probably until some way into 2025.
Well, thanks so much, Tom, for sharing this with us.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Thanks for listening to The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by Julia Press with support from David Fox. It was edited by Aaron Edwards and Greg White. It was mixed by Alex Sugiura and fact-checked by Adriana Tapia. Naomi Shavin, who also edited this episode, is our senior producer. Elizabeth Ponso is our senior editor. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. Please follow and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps new listeners find the show. We'll be back tomorrow.